The US government is set to declare that fossil fuel emissions are no longer considered the driver of climate change or a threat to human health. This move could mark the most dramatic ever reversal in climate policy. For 16 years, Americans have been told greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide are an urgent danger. And now, the US Environmental Protection Agency plans to reverse that position. Here in Britain, we're locked into costly net zero plans, from banning the sale of petrol cars to heat pump schemes, and critics say we are paying the price through higher bills and green taxes. So if America is stepping back, should we also be doing the same? Joining me to unpack this is Professor Steve Koonin, a physicist at Stanford University, a former science chief for President Obama, and co author of a new review for climate science that helped shape the new proposal. Now, we're going to look at the science behind this move and the legal battles ahead, and what lessons Britain should take before spending hundreds of billions on net zero. Welcome, Steve. It's brilliant to have you on.
That's great to be chatting with you, Lucy.
So, Steve, let's start with why this matters here in the UK. How big a moment is this, not just for America, but for Britain, when the US is signaling that fossil fuel emissions may no longer justify so many climate based restrictions?
I think it is a relatively big deal. Here in the US, it is a turning point in the discussion of climate science. For too long, we've heard just one side of the climate science story. Many important nuances and details have not reached the public through the media or the political dialogue. And so, for the first time, we've got an official government report, which I was one of 5 co-authors, that really lays out the facts and the nuances. It does not purport to determine policy. Science is only one input to policy making, but it does, I think, raise the bar on the quality of science that's being fed into the policy making process.
Well, people would claim that because the Trump administration has a bias towards drilling and fossil fuels, that this has been politically influenced. What would you say to them?
Well, the 5 of us who wrote the report are highly credentialed scientists who have decades of experience among us. And of course, we've been careful in putting the report together to cite only the official data, the peer-reviewed literature, or in many cases, the official UN and US government assessment reports. And so it's pretty difficult to say you're biased when you rely on sources like that.
Well, your report found US greenhouse gases have minimal measurable impact on people's health and the economy. What was the data that led you to that conclusion? Because, of course, the UN Climate Change Committee has a very different view, and that is
Yes.
a group of many scientists.
So one of the most telling pieces of evidence on the economic impact on the US of rising temperatures is a graph that was put out by the Biden administration in March of 2023, so about 2.5 years ago, which could be summarized. It's based upon a dozen peer-reviewed studies that they cite, which can be summarized as a few percent for a few degrees of warming. In other words, if we look over the next 70 years, if the economy were to grow at 2% a year, which is kind of its historical average or target, then it would be 4 times bigger than it is today. They claim that the impact of warming of a few degrees would be to decrease that 4 times by a few percent. And so instead of getting 400% growth 4 times, you might get 380% growth. That's in the noise, as we physicists say, much too small a difference to be able to project with confidence. So in fact, the official government reports from a Democratic administration say that the economic impact of warming on the U.S. will be minimal. You can find similar graphs for the globe as a whole. Certainly, some countries will be impacted more. I would expect the poorer countries will be impacted since they're less resilient. But for the globe as a whole, this is hardly existential, catastrophic crisis.
We have seen climate change as an existential, catastrophic climate crisis. It is not just the projections of the economy. For example, in 2023, there was a major study of over 800 urban areas across Europe, which found extreme temperatures are already causing over 100,000 deaths a year in major cities. And this is projected to rise by 50%. So adding 2.3 million deaths. That's just one element of some of these projections. What do you say to that?
It is the usual artifice of looking only at one side of the ledger. Certainly, people dying from heat is a terrible thing, but you have to understand that far fewer people are dying from extreme cold as temperatures warm. Globally, about 9 times as many people die from extreme cold than from extreme heat. And as the average temperature warms, the cold temperatures are getting warmer more rapidly than the warm temperatures are. So, in fact, net fewer people are dying from extreme temperatures. Of course, it isn't news when you have a cold snap and fewer people die. You'll never see that in the media. It is, of course, news when you have a heat snap and some additional people die. So again, important to look at the bigger picture, and by and large, the official reports have not been giving the public or the decision makers that bigger picture.
Hello, I'm Bev Turner. Now, it can feel like the money in our bank accounts at the moment does not keep up with the cost of living, and maybe there's a solution. I'm here today with the CEO of TallyMoney, Cameron Parry. Cameron, what is TallyMoney?
Well, Bev, with TallyMoney, you get a current account and a debit card, but instead of pounds, you use milligrams of gold as your everyday money.
So why gold?
Gold traditionally is a great store of value. It has, on average, gone up at over 11% per annum for the last 25 years against the pound. It's tripled in value in the last decade. And in the last 2 years alone, it's increased by 50% against the pound. Banks' savings products just can't compete with that level of growth.
But this isn't just about gold. This is about a currency that you guys have created at TallyMoney. Explain it to me as though I'm an idiot.
So, look, people need to be able to hold their earnings and build their savings in a money that retains its value and remains in their legal control and remains theirs to access, away from government control.
Great. You had me at not exposed to government control.
You should feel safe and happy with your money. You should have peace of mind the more money you see in your bank balance, and that's the type of thing we're trying to deliver, and give people choice in the type of money they get to use every day.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Cameron. Thank you.
Why then does the UN Climate Change Committee warn of catastrophe? They warn of increased wildfires, increased precipitate rain, increased heat waves, and increased hurricanes. They are making projections. They've modeled it very carefully. Why is that happening?
Yeah, well, it turns out that the models are pretty awful as we go through the report. They disagree by a factor of 3 among them.
Yeah.
Oh,
What do you mean
so
by that?
the world has about 40 different models that are put together by different modeling centers around the world. And you can take each of those models and ask, how sensitive are you to carbon dioxide? In other words, if I magically took today's or pre-industrial level of carbon dioxide, what it was in the 19th century, and magically doubled it, how much would the temperature go up? That's a measure of the sensitivity of each model. The models among themselves differ by more than a factor of 3 in the sensitivity. The temperature rise goes in one model 1.8 degrees Celsius, and in another one it's 5.7 or something like that. So the models do not agree among themselves. And when you get to some of the finer details, not only the global temperature, but how did the temperature rise, let's say, in the U.S. Corn Belt, which is 11 states in the center of the country, the models, they all get it wrong. They warm much too rapidly compared to what has actually been observed. So I do not put a lot of stake in the models. And in fact, the professionals say they give us only a hazy picture of what might be coming and are not at all fit for purpose at the regional level.
You sent me something which was really surprising to me. It was the latest UN climate science report, which is the IPCC. And you sent me this table showing that there are no observable trends for most climate impact drivers. So, something you've highlighted. Can you just explain that table and how it fits in with these other warnings about heat, drought, and rainfall extremes?
So the table is in chapter 12 of the most recent UN assessment working group 1. Um, and what it shows is for about 30 different climate impact drivers, as they call them: high temperatures, low temperatures, storms, floods, droughts, sea level rise, and so on. They have asked, has a trend been observed in the last century, let's say? And for the great majority of those types of events, the table is blank. Namely, we have not seen a trend, let alone attributed it to human influences. There are other columns in that table which talk about whether uh, we might expect that trend to emerge by the middle of the century or by the end of the century. But right now, there's no evidence that we've broken the climate.
But the evidence is that we will, unless we do something urgently. And this latest ruling in America, many people say will be catastrophic because of these forecasts. And what you're saying is that the forecasts are out, but what if they're not?
Yeah, the forecasts are based upon models that are acknowledged to be unreliable and also upon extreme scenarios for what future emissions will be that the IPCC itself declares as implausible.
So here in the UK, we are legally bound to hit net zero, or virtually everything shall be net zero by 2050. We've got plans to ban the sale of petrol cars, where people are encouraged to have costly heat pump schemes, and we have got rising green taxes that are costing us billions. Should our government be rethinking these measures in the light of what the proposals are in America?
I think so. I mean, again, government policy must take the scientific picture, and we've tried in our report to paint a more accurate and nuanced scientific picture, and fold it together with economic considerations, technology considerations, behavior, ethics, politics, and so on. Those are all the messy things that I, as a physicist, don't want to have anything to do with. But I think what one can say is that the size of the UK, 60, 70 million people, is so small that anything you can imagine it doing to reduce emissions will have minimal direct effect on the climate. Of course, you could say, well, UK is going to be a leader and the rest of the world will follow. Um, that's a value judgment or a political judgment that's beyond my competence. But I look at other instances where the most of the world is doing what it needs to do to get energy and not following some other nation.
So do you think Britain risks damaging its economy for little climate benefit. I know that it contribute less than 1% to global emissions, global CO2
Yeah, I
emissions.
haven't looked up the exact numbers, but it's certainly less than 1%. Um, I think it's not that Britain will damage its economy. I think it is already damaging its economy. The grid is becoming more expensive, uh, less stable because of the push to wind and solar. Expensive energy is shutting down manufacturing, and the costs are being borne by households. From this side of the pond, it looks like economic suicide for not very much benefit, if any, at all.
Well, the Labour government say these costs will come down when we have clean, green energy and we're not relying on dictators and volatile markets to dictate our prices. So, what do you say to that?
Yeah. The current push, as I understand it, is for wind and solar.
Yeah.
And you cannot build a reliable electrical system on wind and solar. No doubt people in the UK are familiar with Dunkelflaute, namely the long, windless, sunless periods where wind and solar do not produce any electricity. And if those occur, as they must and will, you have to have some kind of backup system, whether it's nuclear power or gas powered turbines or big batteries. That backup system adds enormously to the cost of wind and solar alone. And so you wind up paying 2 or 3 times what you thought you were going to pay. So I think it's a fantasy to believe that a wind and solar system will actually be cheaper than, let's say, a gas or coal powered system. I just don't believe the politicians, and I can tell you that most grid experts don't believe them either.
Your role in the recent move by the Environmental Protection Agency's decision or plan to reverse this backbone of US climate policies is important to understand. So, can we just clarify exactly what you and your colleagues did in this report? And it was a report from the Department of Energy. Your Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, actually commissioned you to do it, asked you to do it. Presumably, did he cherry pick scientists that he would think would fall in favor, would write a report in favor of what the Trump administration wanted to do? Or do you think you were just picked because of your credentials?
I think the secretary picked the 5 of us because he believed that we had a realistic view of climate science, an informed view. We're all credentialed scientists. And we were also willing to speak our minds about the science and back it up, of course, with references. We came together in about, I would say, 6 weeks to produce a reviewable draft. The final report's about 150 pages. Um, the report went through a peer review in which I can tell you sometimes hostile reviewers read the report, made comments, and we modified the report in some cases in response to those comments because we're interested in getting it right. The report is not an encyclopedia of climate science. It would have taken much too long and far more people than we had available. Rather, it focuses on topics that satisfy 4 criteria. One is that it be germane to the United States. The second, it be covered by a serious academic peer-reviewed literature. The third is that it has been significantly misrepresented in the political, popular, and in some cases, assessment reports.
What climate change misrepresented, you mean?
Yes, aspects of
Yeah.
climate change, whether it's sea level rise or hurricanes or whatever. And then finally, it'd be something that it would be within our competence. It's just about climate. It's not about energy at all. And we think we produced a pretty good report.
So why do you think climate models and climate scientists are exaggerating this warming and our influence on that warming? Why
Yeah.
are they running hot?
Well, the climate models, of course, do what they do. And I can tell you that climate modeling, particularly uh, the response to rising greenhouse gas concentrations, is a tremendously difficult, challenging technical problem. You're trying to find the response, the changes, in a complicated, chaotic, multi-scale system, oceans, atmospheres, for which you have very little data. I can go into more of those challenges if you like, but it's one of the grand challenges in computational science. On the
So
display,
would
okay, go ahead.
would you say then humans are not influencing the climate? And given that it's complex and that we don't really understand it, isn't it better to shore up our systems so that we are protected for what could be a worst case scenario?
Um, that is a value judgment. That's not science. And I will leave it to the broader society to decide whether it needs to shore up or not. That'll depend upon the costs, the disruption, the degree of risk, and so on. And you got to remember that there are countervailing considerations. Most importantly, roughly half of the world needs more energy than it's got. And fossil fuels are right now the most reliable and convenient way for them to get it. So, as one goes about making those choices or examining those choices, it's not just, oh my God, the climate's going to get us and we better reduce our emissions.
I mean, we often hear it quoted over here that 99% of scientists agree that we are in an emergency situation, that the climate is warming, the drivers are human based, and that we need to do something. Are you not just kind of a voice in the wind, you and your colleagues? I mean, when there's so many other people saying something different, you're saying that you're citing data, but presumably there's lots of data that says something different. Anyone can cherry pick data to say
Yeah.
what they want to say.
Um,
One could argue.
right. And so on the 99% first, it's what are we talking about, right? Is the climate changing? Sure, count me in. Uh, are greenhouse gases growing in the atmosphere? Yeah, and it's mostly due to fossil fuels. I'm on board with that. Uh, do those growing greenhouse gases exert a warming influence on the climate? Absolutely. I don't think there's any disagreement about that. But then you have to ask, how does the climate respond to those greenhouse gases? And is it going to be um, significant? Not so sure. And then, will it have catastrophic impacts on society? I'm not on board with that. So it's not just so simple as I'm denying the 99%. What what we need, I think, is an honest public discussion of the science. And I'm encouraged that with the release of this report, we may well be getting that. The first of all, the report is open for public comment until early September. There's a portal on the web where people can submit comments, and my colleagues and I have promised a serious response to all serious scientific comments. Second, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in the U.S. has, in the last day or so, announced a fast track study examining the health and societal impacts of greenhouse gas emissions, no doubt in response to our report and the EPA's action. They hope to have their report done, they say, by September, end of September.
EPA being Environmental Protection
Yes,
Agency.
the
Yeah,
Environmental
but
Administration, right? And
yeah.
and I'm hoping it's not there yet for after everybody's finished their reports and we've had a chance to compare and contrast, that we have some kind of public workshop, conference, where the points of agreement and disagreement are exposed to the public.
Do you have interactions with other scientists who are afraid to speak out? Do you think there's a level of censorship in this debate?
Oh, absolutely. I don't know if it's overt censorship, it's fear of being canceled. When I wrote my book, and I like to think that the reports are unsettled, published 2021 and then updated a year ago. I like to think that the report is a little bit like the book on steroids. I have four other colleagues who have written the report. They have different knowledge, different perspectives than I, but basically,
Do you want to name the report in case people want to look it up?
it is a critical review of the impact of greenhouse gas emissions on the U.S. or something like that. I mean, I can look
Yeah,
up the
which is
exact title.
recent. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but if you search the web for DOE climate report, you'll find it. Um,
And so what
and
you've done is condensed your knowledge, your thinking, what you've done in the book into this report with your colleagues and found and come to this finding. Yeah.
yeah, and they have, I mean, they have contributed tremendous new material and new insights. There are sort of three main um, lines of exposition. One is show the actual data. All right. So just to give one example, well, let me go through the other two. The second is show just how well or poorly the models perform, both in terms of their ability to reproduce the past and the divergence of their projections of the future. And then the third is show that the projected impacts are really minimal. And you can find those themes through the book. But let me just give you one about showing the data. The U.S. is fortunate to have about a little more than 1,000 long-term weather stations that go back to the 1870s. And there are careful records for each one of them. And one of my co-authors, John Christie, is an expert at mining those old weather records. And so he went back to the observer's sheet for Kerrville, Texas. In 1900, in July, you can see the sheet, it's handwritten. And it shows on July 14th and 15th, there were 13 inches of rain that fell there in Kerrville in 1900. And the observer's note says the river rose 33 feet the next couple days, which is the greatest it had ever risen since 1860 at that time. Well, that's almost exactly the same kind of event that we saw at the beginning of July of this year. And of course, everybody was screaming, it's climate change. Humans have made this a lot worse. Well, in 1900, human influences were effectively zero. And so how can it be attributed to human causes recently when the same thing happened all by itself in 1900? So that's part of what showing the data really tries to teach people.
So we've got the UK's Office for Budget Responsibility, and that estimates that net zero is going to cost the UK 800 billion, 30 billion a year, at least until 2051. Do you think that level of spending is justified, or do you think we should be doing something like adapting or new technology? What would you suggest?
I think the most sensible strategy right now is twofold. One is adapt. Spend money on adapting to climate change. Adaptation has many things to recommend it. It's proportional. So if things get worse, you adapt more, or if it's not so bad, you adapt less. The second is it's local. People see the effects of adaptation and so are more likely to support it rather than reducing emissions, which have some vague effect decades from now and halfway around the world. And the
What
third
does
is that,
adaptation look like? Yeah.
I'm
What do you
sorry,
mean?
well, most obviously, seawalls, air conditioning. Having lived in London for 5 years, I know air conditioning is not as common there as it might be. Um, and adaptation is also economical right now.
Yeah.
So beyond adaptation, I think R&D to try to demonstrate emissions reducing technologies that are no more expensive than
Right.
all the alternatives is really important. China's President Xi has said they will not change China's electricity system until they have an alternative that is workable. And we have rushed headlong in the West, doing exactly the opposite. And it's causing all kinds of chaos and costing us a lot of money. As I said, I lived in London for 5 years. I go back more recently, now 20 years later, and things are not as good. And you could sure spend that money in more productive ways.
Yeah, we have a lot of fines being issued for ULEZ, for the emissions and people going through. So it's a very controversial area. I mean, do you think this move by the US, the Environmental Protection Administration, do you think that could be part of a broader global shift away from net zero targets? Do you think there's a sort of change in thinking, or do you think that it's a sort of flash in the pan? And it
No,
presumably
my hope is that it's a kind of emperor's new clothes moment, for particularly Europe, Japan, Australia, Canada. Um, the energy transition or implementing the energy transition is expensive, disruptive, and ultimately not particularly effective because emissions from the rest of the world are rising rapidly. And so I would hope that this is a moment where people will be asking, tell me again, why are we doing all of this? And that might lead to a more realistic examination of what the science says and what it doesn't say.
what would be the drivers of such disruptive, expensive, and potentially economically damaging policies? If there are scientists and headlines and politicians saying that this is important, it's an emergency, we are heading for a catastrophe, that's a lot of the mantra. This is apocalyptic kind of warnings. Why is that happening? Why is this mantra being repeated so often if what
Well,
you say is
I think if you look around the world, the mantra is being said more quietly, in many cases, or in fact, the words are changing a little bit. So the EU has recently embraced nuclear power more than it might have otherwise. I know that the internal combustion engine ban has been relaxed a bit in the UK, and my guess is it will be relaxed some more. Um, I know that they're having trouble with the wind auctions,
in
and
Germany, they just couldn't sell any. Is that
yeah,
right? Yes.
yeah,
Just
yeah.
recently, they
So,
couldn't.
so
Yeah.
the world has did rush headlong into this energy transition, and it suddenly finds out that, my God, this is more disruptive and more expensive than we thought, and so it is time to have a rethink.
So, in final question, really, what's the one thing you'd change about the way climate science is used in policy making?
I think that the policymakers and the public actually should be enraged to find out that there are important things that they have not been told or have been said very quietly. No long-term trend in hurricanes, for example. Um, the decline of weather-related deaths, how precipitous that has been over the last century. Um, and so I think they should be asking much harder questions of the consensus scientists than they have in the past. And of course, there are more than a few scientists like myself who are happy to help them ask those questions so that everybody gets a more complete and nuanced picture of what the science is really saying.
So, your key message about what the US is doing and what it means for the UK, is there something you could end on for that?
Yeah, I think for the first time we've got a serious challenge to the prevailing alleged scientific consensus. And I think that that will open up into a more full-throated public discussion, debate, and that will educate the public and the decision makers as to what science-informed policy really is. And I would hope that the UK would I hope that the UK would do the same. I mean, it is, we live in a fact-based, or should live in a fact-based political system. Everybody says follow the science. The problem is people